The human brain is like a station on the radio dial, parked in one spot. It is deaf to all the other stations, the animals, rocks, trees, simultaneously broadcasting across the whole spectrum of sentience. So you probably know that when scientists first started studying elephants, that the idea that they were communicating in sounds that we couldn't perceive was ridiculous. That was when it was first published, it was very much dismissed and criticized. So this is another quote referring to that. Research on elephant infrasonic communication revealed a deeply human bias in our scientific understanding of the world. In the absence of sounds we could hear, scientists simply assumed animals weren't making sound. Scientists assumed an absence of communication. And so now we know that elephants have a very sophisticated way of communicating over very long distances because their infrasonic can travel very long distances. That kind of wavelength can go a long way. Here's another one. Scientists have documented the ability of species without ears or any apparent means of hearing to interpret and respond to complex information conveyed through this sound. The Earth is in continuous conversation. This is Karen Baker is a scientist and author. She just wrote a book a few years ago called The Sounds of Life, which is it topic of plants is just one little chapter, and she's got all kinds of interesting looking at different organisms and then soundscapes. Has anyone taken like conservation biology here? Do they talk about soundscapes, like ecosystem noise, sound a little bit? Yeah, it really blew me away. I had not really thought too much about it, and this book just did an awesome job talking about soundscapes and ecological, being able to infer the health of an ecosystem just by the sounds that it's making, and how with our digital technology now, they're really making advances on that especially with respect to how to use that information to conserve and help keep our places wild and our animals from not going extinct. So the info on the book is in the notes section if you're interested. Um, and then I did add a little blurb here because it's relevant. Sound travels 4 times faster in water than air. I, I found that finally. I had it in my head, but wasn't sure of the exact number, so I didn't want to put it in right away. But 4 times faster in water. So remember, in the soil, more than half the body of the plant is in the soil, and there's hopefully water in the soil for that plant. So thinking about movement, sound moving in the soil system, in the water, in the soil. So think about that. And then I wanted to go back to this idea of cavitation. We talked about that. So this is something where they point to that they're producing sound, but it's more just a physiological mechanism. It's not something they're doing on purpose. When those gas bubbles come out of solution in the xylem tissue, it can actually create like a popping sound. And they've known about that for a long time, but now scientists are starting to look at that and say, are other plants nearby using that as information of what's going on in the environment? Are they picking up on that and potentially relating that to drought conditions? And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. And so then we got into looking at the plant body a little bit, remembering, that you got the above ground part and then the below ground. And so they've already been looking at trichomes, the hairs on the leaves, and that those would be really a good part of the plant body to think about. They're using their trichomes to detect sound vibrations, just like the cilia in our ear is being used. Below ground is lagging a little bit. Can you think of something below ground in the roots in particular that might be picking up on vibrations? What part of the root?
Transition zone, like their brain.
The transition zone, yep, right by the root tips, right? So the root tips, they're looking at root tips. Any other part that you think might be more sensitive to sound vibrations than like a just big old taproot or something? What other part of the root? Kind of similar to trichomes.
Yeah.
Root hairs, root hairs. I was trying to find some information. I'm not finding much yet, but I saw one blurb somewhere over the summer, and I'm trying to track that down where I read that. But I wouldn't be surprised if they start looking more intensely at root tips and root hairs. And so I'm going to try to see if I can find anything in this next week or so that maybe was pointing to that. Um, so we went through all of this last time before the exam. So then they started narrowing into at the cellular level, there's these channels, protein channels that could be serving. They know they serve as touch sensitive mechanisms, and they know that touch and hearing is very closely linked, especially with the plant body. And so they're starting to look at that. Um, so we went through that. And then I showed this picture with the cell and the idea of sound vibrations impacting the mechanosensitive channels. In this case, they're showing calcium flowing through. They're showing that there's something going on with the membrane, that there's different tension forces throughout the membrane that the plant could be using as a source of information. So they've been making some progress. We talked about how sound impacts all kinds of organisms and that they've done some interesting studies with Kobe beef and the vineyards. And then we looked at this with Monica Gagliano and Stefano Mancuso's work with the roots that he did show in that video that we were just looking at, where he showed this data of the sound coming from the left in this image and the roots starting to grow, I should say, grow toward the sound. And then they were trying a bunch of different frequencies and found that they kind of hit um, some better frequencies that really caused the bending. And then this is what we were listening to in that video with those clicking noises. So that figure B or C, I should say, was actually, they were cataloging the sounds that the roots are making. And again, this is something that's not well developed in the research arena yet, but they are looking at, it's a pretty interesting hypothesis that the clicking noises are being heard by nearby roots, and that's how they know not to entangle with each other and behave more like the swarm behavior that you see in ant colonies or birds flying or fish swimming in flocks and swarms. So then we talked about the apple and Colecroft experiment where the insect was chewing on the plant. So they did a series of experiments to show that the plant was definitely responding by producing different ramped up secondary metabolites in response to the chewing, but they didn't really do the same amount of production of secondary metabolites if it was just the control or wind blowing, that kind of vibration, or a leafhopper's mating call. That didn't really have any impact. So now they know that it's this ecologically relevant information that the plant was able to pick up on. And they claimed in their paper that it just seems to make sense. They're probably doing it through the mechanoreception properties, and that sound has been surrounding organisms since the dawn of time, and that it makes sense that they're paying attention to that. And they said more research is needed. So then another group, so now this is new information. Now another group came along and said, yeah, let's look at this a little bit more. So they started honing in on trichomes of Arabidopsis, and they were, well, let's just say I skimmed through the paper. It was heavy, heavy mathematical calculations and explanations. I know it was peer-reviewed paper by some other people, other scientists that were in the same general field as these scientists. So I'm trusting that they thought it was a well-done study and deserved to be published because the math in there was scary. So anyways, what they concluded is that the trichomes were able to pick up the vibration of the chewing, and that they surmise that the trichomes are kind of amplifying the ability of Arabidopsis to figure out what's going on. I'm getting chewed on by a caterpillar. I need to start defending myself. So they think it goes in tandem with what Apple and Cockcroft were finding of the chewing noise of the caterpillar. They're saying the trichomes are really sensitive to that and we're picking it up. And it was helping the plant. Okay, so some interesting initial studies. Then this one, so it's a little challenging to sometimes get at plant behavior because plants don't behave like mice or rats do when you do behavior in animal studies. So Monica Gagliano came up with this idea of using mazes, like they often use, mazes for mice or rats and have different things at different points in the maze and see what they do. And so she took that kind of model and said, let's put it into this plant behavior study and let's ask if they can use sound to locate water, which is very relevant for plants, obviously. And so she designed these Y-maze apparatuses that the seedling would go into the soil, into the white part of the Y maze. So that was the pot. And then it's kind of the split design where the roots had a choice of where to grow, either into the left part of the maze or the right part of the maze. And then she, in the bottom, those black parts there, those are the plastic pots. And then she had them sitting in plastic trays. So then she put the seeds in there and allowed them to germinate and grow, and they got to choose which way their root growth was going to go, and or not. And so they were looking at the sound of water, especially moving water, and whether or not plants can hear that and respond to it appropriately. So the idea is that plants, when they're living their life in a natural setting, they aren't always surrounded by water or immersed in water. They have periods of time where it can be nothing. And so, and of course, every living organism needs water to survive. So this patchy distribution makes it so that plants are should be very aware of where is the water and making sure they get enough of it. Now they can't get up and move, but they can grow their roots toward the source of water. And so they're measuring root growth here and root biomass when they were doing this experiment. So if they don't have any kind of moisture gradient to sense in the soil system, so plants do that. They know that they can sense the moisture gradient. So, first it's just, dry, then it's slightly damp, then it's more damp, now it's getting wet. They can sense that and they can move toward the wetter soil. But if you deny that to them, can they figure out where the water is? And so this was part of the experiment. In the absence of water, so no moisture gradient, are they going to be able to locate the water? So she set up this experimental design. So up top, you have the WTR that stands for water. So she had the 100 mils of water contained in one of the trays that the pots were sitting in. Okay. Then another setup was the water dash pipe. That is where they wrapped tubing around the pot and pumped water through it. So there was running water going through that tubing around one of the pots, but not the other. And then they had another where they did a recording of the water. And so they had either a recording of the water, white noise, or nothing, 0 hertz. And so that was kind of the setup that they were doing. And then when they were collecting their data, they could get the plant out of the maze and they could see the difference in the root growth between in the maze, did it go left or did it go right? So that's what they're trying to show here, that in this case, the roots were clearly going off to the left. All right. So this is some of the data. So now the way to interpret this, the 0 point is right in the middle here. So the proportion of directional response. And so these are all treatments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. And then, you have the left pot and the right pot, or A and B. And so here they had going is in the left pot, there was water. In the right pot, nothing. And the fact that the bar graph here is more off into that direction, the bigger part of the graph is that way. That means it was choosing water. Does that make sense? Let me erase that. So water pipe versus nothing. So now they don't have any moisture gradient. When it's the water pipe, that means it was just that tubing wrapped around the pipe. So there's no moisture gradient that they were queuing in on. And yet you still got almost the same exact response, it looks like, compared to treatment 1. This is interesting though. Water recording versus nothing. What did they prefer? Which part of the graph is bigger, off toward the left or off toward the right? Yeah, toward the right. Kind of makes you scratch your head a little. It's like, ooh, I would have predicted they would have wanted to go toward the water recording. But they think what's going on here is that the electromagnetic field that the recording was giving off, they were picking up on it. And that was interesting in and of itself, because this was one of the first studies to point to that idea. Ooh, they might be picking up on that. And so, and this was published, back in 2013, I think. So it's a relatively new idea. Noise, and look at here, noise, just white noise versus nothing. They didn't like the white noise either. They definitely went toward nothing. 0 hertz, again, to nothing. So it seems like the recordings of all those, they're like, yeah, I don't really like that, so to speak. Not playing was a little bit better, probably because the electromagnetic field was turned off. It was just sitting there. Okay, and then a recording of the water versus water. Definitely they like the water, which makes sense because that's what they grew up in, so to speak. Evolutionarily speaking, they're used to just water in the soil, not a recording of water. And they could sense the moisture gradient and move toward it. And then the next one, water recording and noise. You can see again, they're kind of confused. They don't seem to like the recording issue. Um, I thought I had it in here. Anyways, I don't see it. Okay. And then recording of the water. Oh, a recording of the water. Oh, you're not letting me write. Ay, ay, ay. So the recording of the water, the very last one, and zero. So they had 0 hertz. That's just not letting me write. Can see that they preferred the recording of the water over just 0 hertz turned on, but nothing coming out. So this was very controversial when this was published and got Dr. Gagliano in some hot water from a lot of her fellow scientists. So the conclusions, our results demonstrate that garden pea seedlings respond to acoustic vibrations generated by water moving inside the pipes and propagated through the substrate. So whether it's when they give it just water into the soil or the pipe wrapped around the pot. They can equally detect and use moisture or acoustic cues to locate water, but also show that roots can be selective about which cue is most advantageous in what circumstance. So going back to this again. So when they have the recording or the actual water and the moisture gradient, they're really paying attention to the moisture gradient. That kind of seems to trump everything. But then here they're looking at what the weirdness we were looking at. That there's something going on with the recording giving off some energy they didn't like, the magnetic field. So that's something that, again, that's the one of the great things about research is that you propose a hypothesis, get everything set up, run the experiment, and then usually the data and results make you think of something else really cool to explore. You never get bored because there's always something else coming out from the research that you do, another question to ask. So they are looking at that idea of the magnetic fields. And then, so we propose that acoustic gradients enable the roots to broadly detect a water source at a distance and conceivably establish the most direct and cost-effective route to that source prior to encountering the associated moisture gradient. So they're able to perceive from a distance is what they're thinking. So if you think about a river running by the plants, and if they can pick up that that's a river sound, water, I need water. And even though their current soil is dry where their roots are, if they grow then toward the sound, then they'll hit the moisture gradient. And so they're saying, in that kind of situation, it would make total sense for the roots to be able to pick up on that cue, even if there's no moisture gradient currently that they're experiencing. Once accessible, the moisture gradient helps the roots to hone in on their target more accurately, hence locating the exact location of the water source. From an evolutionary perspective, the ability to respond to vibrations of various kinds, including, for example, those produced by a running stream, would have been highly relevant to a broad range of species and beneficial to their survival. I mean, that's a very compelling case, don't you think? It makes a lot of sense. And then I just read in a different source, the German government did a study on why city water pipes, like why do they fail? And overwhelmingly, the number one reason is plant roots going into the pipes. And we have that here in Market City too. My neighbor, in fact, she had 2 beautiful trees in her yard, and one of them, the roots got totally into her, unfortunately, the sewage pipes and blocked her sewage pipes, and they had to dig up everything. And so, so the data from cities, with pipes with water flowing through it or sewage, sludgy sewage going through it, they're picking up on it, growing toward it, and unfortunately, in some cases, growing right into it. So I know of a lot of people who have camps around here where they have septic fields. And again, the pipes in the septic field getting all blocked up with plant roots. So, I mean, around here, I've been seeing that idea for a long time, but this was a really well done study, really getting at the some nice experimental design to make a very compelling case. So now they're saying, well, seems like plants can hear, and that they're using that as a way to survive their current environment. And in this case, this paper, they were looking at, it's well known that plants can smell, so to speak, but how is the sound playing into this? And so again, sound is ubiquitous in nature. Okay, for some reason, I cannot use I'll use the laser pointer. Sound is ubiquitous in nature. So they're looking at the sound wave treatment is a new trigger to help protect plants against unfavorable conditions. So they're exploring this idea and looking at how is it impacting at the cellular level what's going on in the plant, including ramping up potentially secondary metabolites. In this case, in figure A, they're looking at the idea of production with the cavitation again. So tension in the xylem vessel, that's talking about the cavitation idea. And then in B, they're trying to show at the cellular level what is going on once they perceive these sounds. Okay. So what they were finding is that the plant could turn on their immunity, their innate immunity in the presence of appropriate sounds. And again, hormones were getting kicked on. So salicylic acid, jasmonic acid, those signaling pathways were getting turned on, which is part of their immune response. Calcium ions, again, were coming into play. In this particular case, they were using 1,000 Hertz vibration. And calcium they're finding are really important secondary messengers in plants. And so they're finding that the sound vibration was enough to trigger their immune reaction to start defending themselves. And again, they often choose Arabidopsis for this kind of exploratory research. So again, showing that sound is kicking on their secondary metabolite response. And so now they started looking at different crop plants in particular because they're very interested in, can we use sound and apply it to growing crops without having to spray so much pesticide and herbicides. So they were looking at rice plants and able to show that they did better against drought. Under those, you don't have to know exactly which kilohertz or hertz, but knowing that it can get them to respond better to abiotic stresses. And then tomato plants that were exposed to sound, it actually impacted their fruit ripening and delayed it. So this is a big deal. That may sound like really trivial, but if you are a person who grows tomatoes, and I was seeing when I was out in California at a conference, I was in the Central Valley of California. There were huge crop productions out there, and huge trucks full of tomatoes, and following behind it on the highway, and just thinking about how many of those tomatoes are going to be destroyed by the time they get to market because they're so fragile. And this is a big deal for growers. They're like, how are we going to make a profit if, we ripen on the vine, but then we have to transport them? And so they've been looking at this, how do we delay fruit softening? And it's a big deal. And so they've looked at this with sound. Could we do something to try to control better when the ripening process is going to occur. And so the idea of even like transporting them green and then applying sound vibrations later to get them to ripen up would be could be advantageous, make a more profit off of that. So here you're looking at just some exposure to sound over several days. So all the way to 2 weeks, it looks like they were doing. And you can see the definite visual ripening going on here. They were getting into how that's happening. Do you remember where we talked about long non-coding RNA? What does that get you thinking about? Long non-coding RNA, and then they're showing a stretch of DNA. Epigenetics. So they're looking at that. Is it, shifting an epigenetic mechanism here? So very, very interesting. Could we, everyone, well, most people desire a nice, soft, ripe tomato, red tomato, although fried green tomatoes is a thing, but most people prefer the ripened up. But shipping them in that manner is very costly, a lot of damage. So they're finding lots of hormones getting turned on in response to different sound vibrations, different frequencies. And so they're really starting to look at this in many, many different plants, different life cycles of the plant, certainly fruit production, but also with pathogen defense mechanisms. Looking at cranking up photosynthesis. Strawberry and rice, they've been doing that with sound. So obviously, if you crank up photosynthesis, you should get bigger plants, bigger strawberries in particular. So they're really, and they're starting to get, all the way down into the cell level, the physiological level, looking at the impact of sound. And as you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Like you can't just say this frequencies does this. Like you can't do that. It really is dependent on the plant. So, but the list goes on and on. Antioxidant activities, oxygen uptake, which I'm not going to get too much into that. That raw signaling is just, it's important for the plant, and that oxygen's part of that. So lots and lots of different attributes of the plant that they're looking at. Here they're looking at drought tolerance, I believe, stimulant and protectant. Oh no, this is all a bunch of stuff. So seed germination and growth promotion, defense responses, stress tolerance, delaying the ripening. So this is just a visual kind of nice snapshot of different things that they've been looking at. And then this table, again, you can see all the different plants that they're playing around with. So it's really becoming a thing. It's not so much can they hear, most scientists are finally accepting that. And now they're starting to go, well, what can we do with this in terms of how can we apply it? Okay, we need to take a break. I forgot. Okay, let's take a break and we'll come back and get into a little bit more about this idea. Okay, so let's continue on. So sound vibrations in the plant world it's a new thing. Exploring that idea is relatively new. They've known about the sense of smell and the volatiles and all of that for quite a while. Sound vibrations, pretty new. And so it met with a lot of criticism. But, if you think about it through the lens of evolution and consider if all organisms were surrounded by sound the minute they became into being, kind of makes sense that that's a selection pressure that they would be sensitive to, and that would be affecting them. And so the plant biologists who were getting a lot of pushback said, okay, well, let's think about it. And they started bringing in these types of ideas of, bacteria were here first. They were the first living organisms on Earth. And so they're over 3.5 billion years old. Some even say pushing it close to 4 billion years ago, bacteria arrived or arose on Earth. So maybe could they have a response to sound vibrations? And so they did some studies. This is with E. coli, which is like the guinea pig in the bacterial world, where they were looking at either no sound, the control, or different frequencies of sound from 100, 500 to 1,000 hertz. And you can clearly see, for those of you who've had Gen Micro, this is a growth curve looking at bacterial growth over time. And so you have on the x-axis the time. It won't let me. I don't know why I can't draw now, but time on the x-axis, and then the population sizes essentially on the y-axis. And you can see that initially at the start of the experiment, there's low growth. And then you can see the upswing in population numbers. And so it's kind of hard to read on here, but the 5,000 hertz, the open circles, look to be the highest growth here. So the other thing this was showing is you can get really good growth with a certain quality of sound vibration, and there's definite differences in how the bacteria respond to different frequencies, which is telling you that they are paying attention to it and are shifting their behavior. In this case, it's growth. Then they said, well, let's look at yeast, which is a pretty simple eukaryotic single-celled organism. Although we make good use of it, and it's for many multi-billion-dollar industries. Here they looked at yeasts growing, again, similar to what they did with E. coli, and they could show again that you can get an increase in growth rate at the right frequency that the yeast are exposed to. They looked at metabolic profiles as well, and that they could show differences there too, based on the frequency. So yeast are able to respond. Then they said, what about microalgae, which are marine algae, and they're micro because they're tiny. And they thought, okay, the algae are the ancestors to plants, terrestrial plants. And again, they could show a response to sound, certain qualities of sound. So then I just ran across this one not too long ago from that book, The Sounds of Life, where they looked at corals, coral reefs. And there's this, of course, as you know, coral bleaching is a real problem. They're trying to find many ways to come at it to try to save the coral reefs. One idea is now using sound vibrations, and they had fantastic results with a controlled study that they did on different coral reefs or different sections of a huge coral reef, where some sections got sound vibrations of a healthy reef being recorded out to the they were made like an artificial reef, and they were able to show that thus healthy sounds made a huge difference in the fish that came there, and then just the life forms that started to come in. And so they're really looking at this as a tool to help the coral reefs. But anyways, with regard to corals, this is, if you're not too familiar with corals, they're an animal algae symbiosis, and they have larvae as part of their life cycle. And when they go to release their gametes, their sperm and their egg, they will synchronize that at the same time. It's usually at night. And if you think about it, this is pretty critical. If you release your sperm at a different time than the eggs, they're not going to meet up with each other. So this is really important. So they synchronize it. Now, if you look at corals, they don't have ears or eyes, brain, no central nervous system. And the coral larvae are about 1 millimeter in size. Once you have the sperm and egg unite and you get the larvae form, They're about the size of a little tiny egg shape, 1 millimeter, but they're covered in tiny hair cells, which again, with everything we've been talking about, should make you go, huh, hair cells. And they use that to swim and to feed. And now they're going, huh, hair cells. And so they came along and did some control experiments, and they were able to do a maze experiment again, where they had speakers playing in the different tubes of these maze with either healthy reef sounds or white noise or silent speakers. And when they ran that experiment several times, they were able to find that the larvae swam and clustered around the healthy reef sounds. And so the larvae went right toward those sound vibrations of what was a healthy reef. And so they were hearing with their whole bodies. They hypothesized with all those tiny hairs vibrating across their body that they're hearing. And so I like they say the tiny cilia hairs act like a simple receptor system. And then I like this quote, little inside out ears swimming around, because we have cilia in our ears. And so really fascinating study that was done relatively recently. And so now people who are involved in trying to bring coral reefs back to healthy states, they're really excited about these results. But larvae that are just out there, tiny little larvae, they're able to direct their movement and go to these relevant sound vibrations. They also found that the corals themselves can emit ultrasonic frequencies. So now what they're investigating is that are the larvae able to discern where they were spawned, so to speak? So do they prefer the sounds of where they were born or not? And that's what they're looking at now. And so and then they also made note that when the spawn is happening, the sperm and egg are getting released at the same time. It's usually at night and it's usually with a full moon. And so again, this idea that the sounds are loudest at that time point really makes you think that maybe they are perceiving those sounds and are coming back to those sounds when they become larvae. So when they're born, I have in the notes, at the moment of giving birth, each reef sings its own lullaby to its young. Each night, the reef sings into the sea, guiding its young back home. So something as tiny as a 1 millimeter sized larva is able to detect and move toward that sound. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So again, corals moving on up, so to speak, through the evolutionary ladder, or tree. And then, of course, you get into the bigger, more complex animals, insects, and then you get into all kinds of different animals beyond that. And that's already been studied. They know that certainly insects and animals contribute. And they don't have to have an ear or an eardrum in order to do that. So then the plant biologist said, okay, well, then why not plants? Why is this so hard to believe? And so it got to the point where at one of the conferences, a bunch of plant biologists and physiologists, mainly older, mainly from America, tried to ban certain scientists from the meeting. They didn't want them attending. And so they were like doing a petition and getting people to sign up that we want these people banned. And so it was getting really ridiculous. So this is why they were coming at it with this logic of it makes sense through the lens of evolution that plants would have this ability too. So this quote is by a famous plant physiologist. You've probably heard conflicting stories about musical preference of plants. Some people are convinced they flourish when exposed to classical. Others believe that heavy metal or bebop does the trick. Strangely, plants' musical tastes show a remarkable congruence with the use with those of the humans reporting them. And so music is not ecologically relevant. So again, that ecologically relevant idea. So yeah, playing just regular music that we listen to plants really isn't going to prove anything. But there are sounds that at least theoretically it could be advantageous for them to hear. So that idea of ecologically meaningful acoustic signals is now, once that started to get across to the naysayers that there are sounds, unfortunately, that one book that got published, they did play music to the plants and claimed certain music was better. And so that's another reason why phytoacoustic research has really lagged. It's because so many people said that was pseudoscience, and which that book largely was. But now they're really pushing and saying they can listen to and hear ecologically meaningful or relevant signals, sound signals. So, and then this is from a published paper in 2016, again, talking about the ecologically relevant sounds and that they should be making good use of that when you think about the process of evolution. And then they look down here, it says, where is it? Yeah, so different plant species and tissues respond to different sound frequencies. And so there's a lot of research left to do because it's not a one size fit all type response by the plants. And so this idea that, okay, they can respond to relevant sounds, they can make sounds. That's still a little bit more, they have a lot of more research to do on why are they making sounds and is it an actual intentional sound. But this topic of buzz pollination has been around for quite a while. They know about this idea. And so this is the idea of plants and their pollinators communicating with each other. And at least 20,000 plants, probably more, are able to do this behavior with the bees. And basically, from the plant's perspective, it's a way for them to tell that this is the right bee that will pollinate me and my kin and not go off to some other plant that's irrelevant for me. I want my pollen to get to the flower of the same species. I don't want it going off, into another one. And so plant pollen thieves and true pollinators, this idea that they can discriminate between the two so that they're only giving the reward to the true pollinator. So let me, this really short video, but it's really cool. So let me show this, do the completion of their life cycle. So once the pollination occurs, of course, then you get the shift from flower to fruit if everything goes okay. And so the buzz pollination idea, for the plant to be able to respond appropriately to the correct frequency is really, really important. So I'll post that video. It's a nice little video for studying as well. And then this one is a relatively new discovery, and it was a serendipitous discovery that it wasn't what they were looking for. They were doing a totally different experiment, and they were looking at some plants in the tropical setting, tropical rainforest, which I'm sure even if you've never gone to one, which I have yet to do, lots and lots of diversity, chock full of plants. You can imagine if you're a plant and you have to rely on a pollinator of some sort, you need to stand out in some way so that you can be conspicuous and get your pollination to occur. And so they discovered that this plant has flowers set up right below a disc-shaped leaf on their plant body. And the disc-shaped leaf was what the scientists that were out there doing a different experiment, they're like, huh, look at that. They were actually bat scientists. They were working with bats. But when they saw that disc-shaped leaf, they're like, wow, that would be something that a bat's echolocation could totally, that'd be perfect for a bat to use that for echolocation. And so they turned their attention to that and started looking at it. And that's what they came down to. All their data was showing that the bats could echolocate to that plant and the flower dangling below it because of that disc-shaped leaf. If they removed the disc-shaped leaf, the bats wouldn't go. And so this idea, again, if you can imagine this plant in the middle of a tropical rainforest, that they need a way to get that to stand out. So the letter A is pointing at that disc-shaped leaf and the flower hanging below it. And so again, this idea that they're using this idea of, in this case, echolocation, which is a very, very special type of vibration that the bats are cueing in on. But the fact that the plant has adapted, they've co-adapted, co-evolved with each other so that the plant can get pollinated with the help of the bat using its echolocation. So that is driving, again, some applied scientists to say, okay, it seems pretty irrefutable now that plants are tuning in to sound. So can we use that in any way in current needs that we have? And so a lot of interest in the agricultural arena, looking at can we use sound to help the plants defend themselves or just overall increase the plant health as it's growing. And so they've been looking at that. Oh, they have a lot of research left to do because they're really just kind of scraping the surface on how this is all working. But they have done some research. This is just a small list of what's been done that they reported on. And again, just trying to show that there's some differences here or different aspects of the plant behavior that they're able to show the vibrations impacting. And so if you think about it, if you use sound as a way to prime a plant, elicitor means you're priming the plant in this case, maybe to defend itself, rather than having them to wait for the pathogen to actually make it there or the pest to make it there. It's definitely cheaper. They do use chemical elicitors currently. That's something that they do, but it's expensive. It's usually hormonal treatments that they'll apply to the plant, and that can be expensive. So sound would be a lot cheaper. And they're looking at, so plant defense is kind of the first bullet, looking at that idea. And then nutritional characteristics, they're looking at if we can get the plant to turn on certain keys, secondary metabolic pathways. A lot of those pathways, what they're producing is really healthy for us. So it's better nutrition for us. Disease resistance. And so one company came up with the plant acoustic frequency technology generator that I think was done in China. And so they're looking at putting these sound generators out in the agricultural fields. And this is, again, still pretty early on. There's not much research done on this yet. Have some of you worked in the biology department with the growth chambers where you open up the growth chambers? Like, I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but we do like the tissue culture. We set them into the growth chambers for the tissue culture experiments. If you've ever noticed when you open up a growth chamber, how noisy it is. It's noisy. I mean, even to my ears, it's like, geez, that's annoying. And that always makes me wonder what are the plants feeling from that in terms of the vibration? Is it a negative impact? It doesn't seem overall just visually like they're harmed, but I'm sure it's doing something because it's loud in there, and it makes me wonder if they have given that much concern. But anyways, so they're looking at this, but I think we talked about this last time that putting a bunch of speakers out there, now we're creating a lot of more sound to a world that already has a lot of sound. And so sound pollution is what some people might call it. And so there's definitely that concern that has to be thought about. But they've done some nice studies with agricultural crops, looking at Medicago, Brassica, Raphanus, so looking at these are all very common plants that are used in agriculture. So we're talking about the alfalfa, broccoli, and radish. And so they were looking at flavonoids are secondary metabolites. It's good for the plant. It's good for us to eat. And they were definitely showing that you could use that. So the saga continues how they're going to actually end up using this in an applied way. But you can definitely see there's some pros to it, and some cons. So I'd like you to kind of think about that as well when you're studying, because there could be some unintended consequences, I guess, to some of this technology. All right, we're going to stop there. So that was the phytoacoustics. The next topic will be on if plants can see, which is probably one of the most controversial ones. Can they see? So we'll talk about that on Wednesday. And on Wednesday, I'm also going to assign an assignment, an individual assignment will be the first assignment that you'll get. And so we'll talk about that on Wednesday.